Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. This video is a brief overview of the immediate lead up to America officially entering World War II. So first, a little bit of a review of what happened with the end of neutrality throughout the late 1930s. As you are already aware, hopefully, if you're one of my students, in 1935 and again in 36, Congress passed a series of neutrality acts which forbade the United States from selling or loaning any kind of weapons to nations that were at war. At this point, Japan was already on the offensive in China. Hitler was making overtures toward beginning to invade places elsewhere in Europe and all of that. So this was almost kind of a preemptive measure by an isolationist Congress to keep America out of war. The tide began to turn in 1937 when Japan did invade mainland China. They'd already been in Manchuria going back to about 1931, but this is a more widespread invasion of China. And so in response, the United States instituted what was called a moral embargo on Japan, where they did not trade numerous goods with the Japanese Empire in an attempt to kind of, exert some economic pressure on them. It specifically, though, omitted oil. Oil was incredibly important to Japan. They relied almost exclusively on the United States for oil, not just for military stuff, but for, heating homes and stuff like that. And so embargoing oil completely was seen as maybe being too provocative a measure, and so America continued to sell oil to Japan, but not much else at all. In 1939, that's when World War II begins in Europe, with Germany invading Poland and a bunch of other countries. The U.S. institutes cash and carry, which was intended to help Great Britain especially. It was a amendment or a carve-out from the Neutrality Acts, where America could provide Great Britain with weapons and war materials so long as they paid cash and carried them on their own ships. America wasn't going to risk their own ships to carry those goods across the pond over to England. In 1940, the Destroyers for Bases deal meant that the United States gave Great Britain 50 destroyers, and those were transferred to the Royal Navy, and in return, America was given land to build military bases various places throughout the British Empire, mostly in the Caribbean, also off the coast of Canada, just to help with mobilization and stuff like that. The big one happens in 1940, September of 1940. That's the Selective Service Act. That is the first peacetime draft in American history. The U.S. military had been taken down to a pretty puny level after World War I. I think by the mid-30s, it was down to only having about 100,000 men total enlisted, and which was not going to be nearly enough if things continued to escalate with Europe and in the Pacific. So they drafted a whole bunch of men into the military in September of 1940, and then did the same thing again in July of 1941 to get America on more of a war footing. 1941, the last big end of neutrality in terms of policy was the Lend-Lease Act, where America loaned weapons and ships to allied nations in Europe, such as Great Britain, France, later to the Soviet Union, also to China. And in return, America was allowed to lease land to build military bases and stuff. Some of those materials were given back to the United States after the war, not all of them necessarily. So, Japan went on the offensive throughout the late 30s and early 40s in an attempt to expand their empire. Japan is a relatively small nation. It's about the size of California. Even back then, the population was pretty high, so not a lot of, room to cultivate natural resources and stuff like that. So, Japan takes over a lot of areas in the Pacific with the goal of obtaining natural resources for industrialization. As Japan had become more aggressive in the Pacific, the U.S. had moved a lot of their naval resources onto bases in the Pacific, especially at Pearl Harbor in Oahu, in the territory of Hawaii, not yet a state, and also to the Philippines, which was an American territory at the time. So the U.S. had a pretty big military presence in the Pacific even before the war. The big ramp up to the war beginning in the Pacific happens in the summer of 1941 when Japan annexes most of Southeast Asia, the area of called French Indochina. That's your modern day Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and those areas. In retaliation for that, the U.S. froze Japanese assets that were in United States banks, and also, this again was the big one, cut off the oil sales to Japan, which was again a provocative measure and made the Japanese a little bit desperate. And the reasoning was that if the Japanese were to attack the United States Navy in Hawaii and the Philippines, it would essentially paralyze the United States for long enough for Japan to take over more areas in the Pacific and obtain oil or other natural resources there. So, on December 7th, 1941, without officially declaring war or notifying the American embassy or anything, Japan launched an attack from the air on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and also on America's forces located in the Philippines at the same time. This was not completely unexpected. Most people in the United States government believed that an attack from the Japanese was coming. They did not know exactly where or when. I think most people thought it was going to be focused more on the Philippines, just because it's closer to Japan, but the brunt of the attack ended up being at Pearl Harbor. The United States the next day declares war on Japan. Franklin Roosevelt goes before Congress and gives the famous speech about it being a date which will live in infamy. After that, Germany declared war on the United States, and then the U.S. declares war on Germany on December 11th, 1941. So America at this point is in a two-front war in World War II. Finally, this is just a partial list of all the damages suffered by the United States at Pearl Harbor. You don't need to write this down in terms of notes, but about 2,400 American sailors were killed. Almost half of those were on one ship, the USS Arizona, which was torpedoed and sank with many men still below deck. It is essentially considered a war grave. The picture on the bottom there is the USS Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor, where you have to basically ride a boat out to a ferry out to the memorial, and you can see from overhead, you can still see the hull of the ship, which has never been raised or moved, again, because it is considered a war grave. In addition to those deaths, another 1,100 people were wounded. Some civilians were killed, worked on or near the naval base there. Two of America's battleships, including the USS Arizona, were sunk and so damaged they couldn't even be repaired or salvaged in any way. A couple other battleships were sunk, but actually were salvaged. They were raised and then repaired to where they could be put back into service later in the war. And the United States lost 188 of their planes. One of the bigger blunders at Pearl Harbor was that the planes were essentially just lined up wing to wing on the runways, which made them very easy targets for the Japanese to just basically mow them all down in one fell swoop. So this, of course, is the big battle cry. Remember Pearl Harbor. This led to a lot of enlistments into the military, and had tremendous impacts on American life, which we'll talk more about as we go further into World War II. That's all for this video. Be sure to post questions if you have any, and let me know if you're one of my students if you have any questions. Cheers.